Hi everyone, Isabel Stewart, We Have Trauma Education, and today is the third video in the Trauma Talk series, and today I'm going to be talking about reactions to trauma and serious threat. So I'm just going to bring up the previous week's slide to remind us of what we discussed, and this is important in today's context. So last week we talked about responses to challenges or threats or a crisis in our lives, and how we get anxious and here reaches a peak, but we do things, either we use our own coping skills, seek support from outside, and a mixture of both in order to begin to deal with that threat, and that takes time. But I'm also interested in what happens when we can't go through that particular process. And in the diagram here, you see that that process has begun. There's a threat or a challenge to the person, and that has begun, but something happens here that interrupts the process, stops the person who desperately wants to process this threat or trauma, but for their own particular reasons and those circumstances, they just can't. And it's not that, believe you me, that they don't want to. They desperately want to, because nobody wants to be in that position of being traumatized. So something happens here, and we can react by being paralyzed, overwhelmed, feeling powerless, or we can collapse. So we may collapse, and then we're left with the particular trauma in our nervous systems and in our bodies, and then we tell ourselves stories about that, and I'll speak about that a bit later. So just to remind people, the difference between responding and reaction in terms of trauma, or that the thinking brain, the human brain, or the thinking brain is seriously impaired when we perceive an overwhelming threat, a threat to life, something that's particularly dangerous to us. So it's either dampened down or offline completely. So that means the parts of our brain that are predominantly in charge in those situations are the survival brain. So there's been what the body and the brain perceives as a threat to our survival. So it takes center stage. So we're left with the survival brain and the emotional brain in charge, which accounts for a lot of the symptoms and feelings that a person might have. In this slide, you will see that there was a threat to the person. It's like they hit a wall, they were overwhelmed, they were powerless, they might have collapsed, they might have been paralyzed, frozen, whatever. But then as we see, over time, something happens where they literally complete the process that was interrupted. Now, that might mean they're in a better position to be able to do that. They might have more resources, more skills, more coping abilities. It might be that this happened to you when you were younger, and then when you were older, or you went for therapy or for help, and so you were able to process that particular trauma. So again, in this slide, you can see that people hit a point, it gets to a point where it is too much, it's overwhelming for the brain and the body. So this part of the slide where we are left with that trauma in our nervous systems and in our bodies that is not processed. And as human beings, we tend to tell ourselves stories about that, try to make meaning of that. And often people will say what's wrong with me? Why can't I get over this? Why can't I deal with it? And remember, as I said, no one that I have ever known wants to be left in that position. But often that is the reality for whatever reason. And they're usually very individual. People cannot process the trauma. So it's trapped literally in their bodies and in their nervous systems, and they may repeatedly tell themselves stories about that. And what often happens as well, particularly in the case of repeated and ongoing and cumulative traumas, is that people develop a sensitivity, and it's a part of their brain called the amygdala in the survival brain, that becomes hypersensitized to any threat or stress, and particularly if it reminds us in any way of previous traumas. So it's almost like a survival brain is on hyper alert, hyper vigilant, watching out for those particular traumas that were damaging or painful for us in some way. So as you can see, maybe the first trauma, and then over time with repeated traumas, our threshold, our tolerance for being overwhelmed becomes lowered over time. And again, the person in no way wants that to happen, and it can be a biological process, and particularly when people have had repeated traumas over their lifetime. So as you can see, because they're unable to be dealt with, the trauma becomes, as I said, cumulative and collective. So more trauma builds up and is trapped in the body. And again, the person, and depending on their stage in life, will begin to tell themselves different stories about what has happened and also what is happening. So that's the end of this talk, and next week I'm going to talk about habitual responses and reactions to when we feel really threatened or when we're overwhelmed. And again, thank you. Bye-bye.